Our guest speakers this afternoon, are Dr. Jason Manning and Dr. Bradley Campbell. Dr. Campbell, an associate professor of sociology at California State University, Los Angeles, earned his BA in sociology from Lee University, his MA in applied sociology from Clemson University, and his PhD in sociology from the University of Virginia. He has published numerous peer-reviewed articles in journals such as Comparative Sociology, International Journal of Law, Crime, and Justice, British Journal of Sociology, and Sociological Theory. In addition, he has a number of media appearances to his credit, including appearances on KPCC's Air Talk and NPR's Here and Now. Dr. Manning earned his BA in sociology at Christopher Newport University and both his MA and PhD in sociology at the University of Virginia. He is associate professor of sociology at West Virginia University and author of numerous peer-reviewed articles in journals such as Sociological Forum and Comparative Sociology. He is also the author of the book Suicide, A Study in Pure Sociology, forthcoming with University of Virginia Press. Together, our guests co-authored The Rise of Victimhood Culture, Microaggressions, Safe Spaces, and the New Culture Wars, which was published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2018. We are honored to have Dr. Campbell and Dr. Manning join us this afternoon. The title of their talk is The Freedom of Dignity and the Tyranny of Victimhood. Please welcome Drs. Manning and Campbell.
Good evening. It's great to be here. I'm Bradley Campbell, so I'll go ahead and start. Jason and I are talking tonight about the freedom of dignity and the tyranny of victimhood. And what we're going to try to do is just discuss some of the sociological conditions that we think are associated with freedom and liberty, and some of the threats then to freedom. And of course, we're not talking about all the possible threats to freedom, but we'll be talking about some of them. So let's start with a recent story. So Samuel Abrams is a professor of politics at Sarah Lawrence College, which is a small liberal arts college about 15 miles north of Manhattan. A few months ago, he published an op-ed piece in the New York Times, and you can see the title of that here, Think Professors Are Liberal, Try School Administrators. So Abrams, who describes himself as conservative-leaning, points out various events put on at the school at the Office of Student Affairs. One was called Microaggressions, another was called Understanding White Privilege, another Stay Healthy, Stay Woke. And what he was describing these as politically lopsided in terms of what is chosen to talk about by the administration. And he says this is the case at universities around the country, that while people have often worried about the skew among professors, the idea that professors tend to be so overwhelmingly liberal, he says it's actually administrators much more than professors. And he talked in the article about some data on this, that looking at what he called student-facing administrators, so administrators whose work deals with students' experiences and housing and things. He found a ratio of 12 liberals for every conservative. That's compared to 6 to 1 for faculty and 2 to 1 for incoming students. So Abrams suggests that's a problem, that their power at setting the agenda at the university threatens the free exchange of ideas, which is especially needed in politically polarized times. So that's the article. Here was the response from Sarah Lawrence College. Now remember, this was an op-ed in the New York Times. This wasn't some right-wing rag somewhere. But this was the reaction. People tried to break into his office. When they were unsuccessful with that, they ripped pictures off of his doors, picture of his family. They put up messages cursing him, demanding he apologize, demanding he go teach somewhere else. There was an emergency meeting of the Student Senate to deal with it. The college president came out and expressed her commitment to diversity and accused Abrams of creating a hostile work environment, and then implied he should have cleared his writings with her first. Now, if you were a time traveler from 10 years ago, or maybe even 5 years ago, you'd have trouble following some of that. You might say, what's a microaggression? What's woke? Why is all this so heated? Why are people storming people's offices, having emergency meetings over a New York Times op-ed? But if you've been around, if you've been following some of the happenings on American college campuses, you're likely familiar with these kinds of conflicts and some of the new terminology, the new moral terminology that's associated with them. So Jason and I are moral sociologists, sociologists of morality. We're interested in people's ideas about right and wrong. Which behaviors do people see as praiseworthy? What do they see as undesirable, as wrong, as evil? And so we're interested in these clashes of right and wrong, how people handle conflicts, whether it's through the legal system, whether it's through violence, through gossip, or something else. And we've written and talked a lot about violence previously. I've done work on genocide. Jason has done work on suicide. But we've always been interested in other kinds of moral conflicts too, and including the moral conflicts going on around us, like at universities. And I've always been interested in things that I thought were peculiar and unusual. So I'd been interested a long time in what has been called hate crime hoaxes. So every now and then you would hear instances of someone faking being a victim of a hate crime, usually at a college campus. There was a case in 2004 where a woman named Carrie Dunn, who was teaching psychology at Claremont McKenna College, was going to give a talk at a forum on racism. And then before the talk, she vandalized her own car with anti-Semitic slurs. And you'd see these instances, and each time the cases would happen, people would react, usually never with any skepticism. There were vigils, canceled classes, these kinds of things that would cause a huge uproar. So I was interested in the reaction to these things really as much as the cases themselves and the environment that occurs in. There's a recent case, and there's a case in the news right now, Jussie Smollett, who a star on the television show Empire, and if what's being reported this week turns out to be the case, this will be probably the most famous example of a hate crime hoax ever. He had reported that he had been attacked in Chicago, and police are now investigating it apparently as a hoax. So I've been interested in this for a while, and so in 2013 I was interested in a case about where there was racist graffiti at Oberlin College. It was causing a campus uproar. And then during all this, someone at Oberlin College spotted a Ku Klux Klansman on campus. This led to canceled classes. And now, if you know anything about Oberlin College, it's a very progressive place. Jason and I were talking about this at the time. It seemed doubtful that there was a Klan chapter on campus, so we thought, surely this is some kind of mistake. And sure enough, it turned out to be someone wrapped in a blanket being mistaken for a Ku Klux Klansman. So as sociologists of morality, this is something that interests us. Jason and I were talking about this, kind of think, why is it that in this extremely progressive place, people are so quick to perceive it as a kind of a hotbed of racism with Klansmen walking around and these kinds of things. So as we were talking about this and looking at Oberlin and stuff, we came across something else that was interesting, the Oberlin Microaggressions website. And so if you don't know what a microaggression is by now, and this was in 2013 the first time we had heard the term, but it's a slight, perhaps even an unintentional slight of an ethnic minority or some other disadvantaged group. And the idea is that even if it's intentional, even if it's small, it adds up over time and does great harm to oppressed groups. So we were looking at this, so we heard of this term the first time then. We were looking at this Oberlin Microaggressions website. Here's an example. One of the posts complained about a white student using the Spanish word football for soccer, and he said, keep my heritage language out of your mouth. There was another student on the website, Oberlin Microaggressions website, who complained about hearing a professor talking to someone else in the gym, and she overheard her say, I'm glad my husband and I both have blue eyes, so our children will have blue eyes. And the comment was, I don't want to hear casual racism coming from my professor. So define this as an act of racism, a microaggression. We then began seeing other examples of microaggression websites. Here's from the Microaggressions Project. And you can see, there are some of these here. The one in the bottom left says, what do you do? And it's the person answers, I'm I'm a professor, and someone says, well, you look too young to be a professor, you look like a student. And so that's an example also of a microaggression. So we were interested in these things, the idea, this is new moral terminology, and the idea that small offenses matter greatly. This then began spreading after we studied these microaggression websites. There have been microaggression training programs implemented at colleges. This is from the University of California, and there have been similar versions elsewhere. At the top there, where are you from, or where were you born, is an example of a microaggression, and it's translated then, the message is, it says that it actually means then you're not a true American. Or other examples there are America is a melting pot, which it says means assimilate to the dominant culture. I believe the most qualified person should get the job. Why are you so quiet? All these could be microaggressions. They've also implemented ways for people to report microaggressions. So at the Harvard School of Public Health, students could report microaggressions on their evaluations. And in 43 out of 138 courses, at least one student said yes, that they had experienced a microaggression. In 7 of the courses, they got 3 or more yes responses, and those courses were being investigated at the time this was reported. At the University of Northern Colorado, there's a bias reporting system where they actually investigated someone for talking about the issues we're talking about now. The article, The Coddling of the American Mind, that was in The Atlantic in 2015 by Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff, was being used in the class. People were reading it, and that itself, the use of it, was investigated. So what was going on then? We wanted to know this. The way people were dealing with offenses here was similar in some ways, but different in others from what you might see in other contexts. So we thought, we eventually decided that there seemed to be a new kind of moral framework, a new moral culture, and one that differed from cultures of the past. So if we look at microaggression complaints, for instance, what were some of their features? Sensitivity to slight. So sensitivity to slight is something that's seen in many different environments, but the idea that small offenses matter greatly, that's what you see here. Not just any small offenses, actually. It was slights that were said to further people's oppression. Appeals to third parties. They were reporting these to others, perhaps even to campus administrators. So, how do people handle conflicts? This is the kind of thing we're interested in. How do they perceive them? How do they handle them? Here, small slights matter. You bring them to the attention of third parties. And we also saw that there was a focus on victimhood, people portraying themselves as victims and calling attention to that, their need for help. It kind of goes into the appeal to third parties. They're asking for help from others. Microaggressions are just one new moral concept. Others came to prominence at the same time. We also began around 2013 hearing about trigger warnings, people asking at many college campuses for trigger warnings for course material. People with trauma can be triggered by various things, and the idea was that if there was course material about violence or depicting oppression and various kinds of things, there should be a trigger warning placed on it. Safe spaces, again, used in different ways, but the way that it began to be used was that people needed to be protected from ideas that went against activist beliefs. Sometimes the idea that the whole campus should be a safe space. And the idea of speech as violence. So this goes in kind of also with the idea of microaggression or safe spaces, the idea that people weren't just being offended, they were being made unsafe. Violence was being done to them. And people began to speak about speech that offended them as actual violence, not metaphorical, but actual violence. Here's an article, this is a series of articles entitled Violence as Self-Defense. This was, so at the University of California at Berkeley, rioters forced the cancellation of a talk by the right-wing provocateur Milo Yiannopoulos. And then in the Daily Californian, the independent student-run newspaper, they published a series of articles called Violence and Self-Defense. The idea was that since Yiannopoulos' speech would have been harmful, that rioting, violence to prevent it, was appropriate. It was self-defense. One protester wrote that letting Yiannopoulos speak was more terrifying to me than potential injury or arrest. Another said, "Our shields are raised against you. no one will protect us, we will protect ourselves. And another said that asking people to maintain peaceful dialogue with those who literally don't think their lives matter is a violent act. So you have this idea that the speech was violent, so shutting down the speech through violence was self-defense. So these were new kinds of moral ideas, or at least things we don't always see, like we see them in different settings. So we're trying to understand then these cultural changes, how morality was changing. And so we drew from ideas first about honor and dignity culture. So as people who had studied violence, we'd studied a lot about honor cultures, and these are cultures where, you can see the people fighting the duel there, like one manifestation of an honor culture is a duel where someone who is offended, someone who's been insulted, challenges someone to a duel. They may fire guns at each other or fight with swords. But the idea is that that's an environment where small slights matter and where the response to them is violent. In an honor culture, honor, or having a reputation for physical bravery, for strength, for willingness to fight, honor acts as a kind of moral status. Honor cultures, though, were replaced mostly by dignity cultures. So a lot of people writing about this talked about the transition from honor to dignity. Dignity is different from honor. Honor is a kind of moral status, but dignity is the idea that every person has equal worth, right? That you have this inherent worth or dignity. And so in a culture of dignity, people are taught to ignore slights. You don't need to worry about what others think of you because you have dignity. People are taught sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me, just ignore it. If there's violence against you, and in this culture, speech and violence are very different. If there's violence against you, you go to the police, you go to the authorities if there are other kinds of theft and other things. So for serious offenses, use the police, the courts. Minor offenses can be discussed, talked out, or maybe ignored. So there had been this transition from honor to dignity. But what we were seeing with microaggression complaints and the idea of safe spaces and other things were moral ideas that really didn't fit in with either one. You had the focus on, you had the sensitivity to slight, the focus on small offenses or microaggressions and things like that. But you didn't have people, like in an honor culture, handling conflicts themselves and portraying themselves as strong and capable of doing that. You had them appealing to others. You also had a new kind of moral status arising. So we thought of this as a culture of victimhood, a victimhood culture, where victimhood, being perceived as a victim of oppression, a particular kind of victimhood, ends up acting as a kind of moral status, where people get aid and all kinds of things. It arises from people's desire to help the oppressed, but also interpreting human interaction in terms of oppression and victimhood. So a new kind of moral status, very different from honor, was operating. So why was this the case? So we tried to understand as sociologists why you get victimhood culture, why it arises in certain environments, why do we get microaggression complaints and demands for safe spaces and these kinds of things. So diversity and equality were important here. So we thought that it might seem paradoxical, but it's actually in more diverse and equal environments where people are most concerned about threats to diversity and equality. It's where people are more diverse, where they're concerned about ethnic slights and slurs and these kinds of things. And also where people are equal to one another, because it's not just that a microaggression is a slur against an ethnic group, but it's a slur against a disadvantaged ethnic group, or a way of putting them down. So you're concerned about threats to equality and diversity. That's what a microaggression is said to be, and these other things. So it's in the most diverse and equal environments where you get the most concern for those, even small offenses, like modern college campuses, for instance. Those aren't the only things that matter, though. The presence of authorities matter. So if we have people appealing to authority, there need to be actual authorities present to appeal to. So on college campuses, you have administrators and so on involved who might be appealed to intervene to stop microaggressions and other kinds of things. And also the rise of new media. People can broadcast their complaints over Twitter and all kinds of other social media and find others who share their experiences and have the same ideas about the world. And so this is also something that heightens this culture that allows it to develop. So diversity, equality, authority, and new media, this is kind of how we thought about explaining it sociologically. People make different kinds of moral claims in different social environments. So what's happened in the last few years since we first began writing on this is that there have been incidents all over the country at college campuses that we see as manifestations of victimhood culture. They're the extremes, often the extreme manifestations, but we would understand events, speakers being shut down, people being run off of a campus, and these kinds of things as arising from this new culture. So at Yale in 2015, Nicholas and Erica Christakis were professors there who were heads of one of the residential colleges there. So people, in these residential colleges, there will be these headmasters who facilitate discussions and these kinds of things. Erica Christakis then, so there was a message sent out by a dean. The dean's office sent a message out about Halloween costumes, warning people not to wear offensive Halloween costumes and that kind of thing. So Erica Christakis, in her role as headmaster of this residential college, sent an email out to the residents facilitating discussions. And she's a psychologist, so she's talking about these kinds of things and in those terms, but wondering if that was the best approach. Is that the best approach for dealing with offensive costumes? Would it be better for students to talk it out? Could people make their own decisions? Does it need to come top down from the administration? So she raised these questions, and the reaction was intense anger from some of the students. They demanded that Erica and her husband Nicholas be fired. A group surrounded Nicholas on campus and yelled profanity at him, accused him and Erica of racism. They accused them of stripping people of their humanity, of creating an unsafe space. There's that concept again. And the Christakises later resigned their position as the heads of the residential college, although Nicholas is a tenured professor there and is still there at Yale in that role. Another instance happened at Evergreen State College, and they had since the 1970s a tradition called a Day of Absence. And the idea was that non-white faculty and students would leave campus for a day, and the idea was to show their importance to the life of the college. So Evergreen State College, if you don't know, is also a very progressive place, very similar to Oberlin. So they had this tradition, but they changed it in 2017. So the organizers did something different. They reversed it and asked for white faculty and white students to leave. Brett Weinstein was among people who objected to that. His argument was just he didn't have an objection to the old Day of Absence, but he said there's a difference between leaving a group leaving themselves to make a point and telling another group to leave, which he thought as racist itself. And he was surrounded on campus. He was screamed at, cursed at, all these things too. Students also surrounded the college president, who apologized, and Weinstein ended up having to hold classes off of campus because his safety was endangered. And eventually, he and his wife both left and got a big settlement for leaving. So one more instance. There are more of these, but just to give some examples. At Reed College, another very progressive place, the group Reedies Against Racism took issue with the humanities course. It was called Humanities 110, Introduction to Western Humanities. It's a year-long required course of all freshmen there, and it focuses on classical Western literature. So this is what the Reedies Against Racism group said. They said, we believe that the first lesson that freshmen should learn about Humanities 110 is that it perpetuates white supremacy by centering whiteness as the only required class at Reed. And they said it was had traumatized students of color. So the group began showing up in every single class to protest. So they had different professors come to speak at the class, like guest lecturers. And every time somebody was giving a lecture, there would be somebody else beside them holding up signs, sometimes making noise. Usually it was done quietly, but not always. They shut down a lecture on the Iliad, for example, and ended up getting someone to pull a lecture on the Epic of Gilgamesh. And then Lucia Martinez Valdivia is an English professor there, and a minority woman, who requested that the group not protest in her class. She said she suffered from PTSD and it would make it too difficult for her. This was the reaction. They said, by saying that any form of protest would trigger your trauma, not only ignores the traumas of students protesting, but creates a hierarchy where your traumas matter more. And they accused her of being anti-black and ableist, and they said, you've refused to critically engage with the anti-blackness and institutional racism reinforced through the syllabus. Another charge against her was that she had worn a "Poetry is Lit" t-shirt, and that this was appropriating black vernacular English and a form of anti-blackness. So the debates over these things, these kinds of things we're talking about, people being driven from campus, surrounded and cursed at over disagreements, demands for safe spaces, all these things. These debates we see as a clash between the newer culture of victimhood and the older culture of dignity, right? So it's not, at least first of all in our work, it's not really about whether they're right or wrong, but how to understand the debate. Why is it so heated? It's because it's a clash of moral cultures. And it's not a clash between the left and right, or not primarily. The adherents of victimhood culture like to portray it this way, and so do many of their conservative critics. And it maybe it will come to be that as things sort it out, but it's not now. If you interpreted it that way, as just a clash between the left and the right in the United States, you'd be puzzled by lots of things, such as that those speaking against it are often on the left themselves. Lucia Martinez Valdivia, Brett Weinstein, Nicholas and Eric Christakis, none of those people are politically conservative. None are on the right. And neither is Barack Obama, who had this to say in 2015. So Obama said, I've heard of some college campuses where they don't want to have a guest speaker who's too conservative, or they don't want to read a book if it has language offensive to African Americans, or somehow sends a signal demeaning, sends a demeaning signal towards women. And then he went on to say, I've got to tell you, I don't agree with that. The idea that when you become students at colleges, you have to be coddled and protected from different points of view. Anybody who comes to speak to you and you disagree with, you should have an argument, but you shouldn't try to silence them by saying you can't come because I'm too sensitive to hear what you have to say. So what Obama and Weinstein and the Christakises and others understand is that these new moral claims that are rising from what we've called victimhood culture aren't compatible with many of the goals of the university, with free speech, with academic freedom, with liberty, as we understand it. They're not the only threat, but one possible threat to good scholarship, to freedom, and other kinds of things. And it may be spreading. So I'll have Jason will come and talk a little bit about tyranny and freedom and the context there.
Tyranny comes from the ancient Greek word tyrant, meaning a ruler with absolute authority. And people nowadays still use the term to refer to a ruler such as a dictator or a despot. But there's also a broader meaning. A standard dictionary definition might be something like oppressive, arbitrary, or unfair rule, or power or control. And we're going to focus on this broader meaning because it helps us highlight that tyranny is not solely a matter of authority figures and their characteristics. Sociologist Max Weber long ago observed that authority is actually a two-sided thing. Rulers only have authority insofar as people obey their orders. They don't have followers because they have authority because they have followers. But it's not just that despots and other tyrants depend on the obedience of their lieutenants and enforcers to maintain power. Even in the most tyrannical dictatorship, tyranny is not something that's entirely top-down. It's that the rank-and-file citizens, the ordinary common people, are active in policing each other. Secret police forces like the German Gestapo or Soviet Stasi, they depended on complaints and denunciations and informing by your ordinary rank-and-file citizens. Authorities in these places constantly urged people to report on one another for any sort of crime, deviance, or even suspicion, and the people cooperated in droves. It's this cooperation by the masses that made 20th century totalitarian societies totalitarian. Every person was a potential agent of the state, and people in these communities had to learn to fear their neighbors because literally millions were sentenced to slavery or execution or torture because a coworker or neighbor or even a family member denounced them to the authorities. So let's consider how this denunciation works in a bit more detail. Sometimes the people lodging these complaints are the true believers, the fanatics, and whatever the ruling ideology is, Nazism, communism, whatever. They're by it whole cloth, and they're on the lookout for any sort of deviations. But that's not the whole story, or even most of the story. Historians who study denunciations find that your average rank-and-file denouncer was somebody motivated more by interpersonal conflicts, the sort of ordinary slights and grievances that come up in day-to-day social life. Historian Jan Gross quotes several personal accounts from those who lived in Soviet-controlled Poland. Quote, "Accusation, denunciation, and personal animosity could lead to arrest at any moment. People were officially encouraged to bring accusations and denunciations. Anybody who had a grudge against somebody else, an old feud, had a stage on which to show his skills. There was a cocked ear willing to listen. A friend of mine had a personal enemy from his school days who accused him of preparing to escape across the frontier. The Soviet authorities had no other proof but sentenced him to 10 years and deported him to the USSR for forced labor." Historian Sheila Fitzpatrick describes similar cases from the denunciation files in Moscow. She describes cases like actors and actresses and opera singers denouncing the directors who wouldn't give them the parts they wanted or otherwise show them the respect they thought they deserved. Or the case of a man who did 8 years of hard labor over a complaint that apparently arose because his neighbor was jealous of the size of his room. What we see here is a situation where authorities are readily available and always encouraging people to bring complaints. And they're extremely responsive to these complaints. All one has to do is frame the complaint in terms of very broad and ill-defined categories that the authorities will respond to. Throw in the word counter-revolutionary or disloyal, or if you're in Nazi Germany, Jewish, or if you're in Russia, capitalist. And the authorities will respond forcefully with a very low standard of proof and very little concern about what's the difference between a small offense and a big offense. The totalitarian state is totalitarian because it offers a service to the people. It will manage their conflicts and punish their enemies. Everyone has easy access to the full power of authorities, and so any schlub can wield the full power of the state. In the words of Jan Gross, "Since anybody can cause anybody else's arrest, Soviet terror acquired that awesome random quality, which rendered it so effective. There were as many reasons to be sent to jail as there were different motivations inspiring individual denunciations. Everybody shared the power to bring down and destroy," end quote. Everybody had the power to destroy, but nobody had the power to protect. And under this kind of social condition, you find other ways of handling conflicts and differences begin to atrophy. People face the situation that they try to handle a conflict in some other way, such as by approaching the person directly and complaining and trying to talk it out. Well, they might offend that person who might in turn denounce them. So people face this logic of they can either handle their grievances through denunciation or they risk getting denounced themselves if they try to handle the conflict in some other way. It becomes denunciation or nothing. Fear and distrust pervade society, and everyone lives under the tyranny of everyone else. Now, these examples are extreme cases, and I'm not going to try to be alarmist and claim anything in modern America comes close to this. People aren't being sent to death camps or whatever, and we have constitutional protections these people couldn't even dream of. The reason for talking about this, though, is that when you look at these extreme situations, you see certain patterns thrown into sharp relief and easily visible, and then later you might see those same patterns playing out in much less extreme versions in much more normal situations. And the basic pattern we're seeing here has some similarities to what we're calling victimhood culture. You have a heightened reliance to complaint on third parties, especially powerful authorities, and a low threshold for what's considered a punishable offense. You have authorities or other third parties who act with little regard to due process and evidence and have a very broad conception of what's considered an offense worth making a big deal about. And we think this similarity extends outward, that victimhood culture is in some ways conducive to tyranny. It is a culture that involves increased demands for regulation, punishment, reductions in due process, and reductions in free speech, and it can create an atmosphere of paranoia in which people worry about who they can trust and what they can say and who might report them next. The first and perhaps most obvious tension between liberty and victimhood culture is the area of freedom of speech. Granted, every human culture puts restrictions on what you can say without getting into trouble, but modern Western cultures tend to put a relatively high value on freedom of speech, and the US stands out even among those as having strong constitutional protections. And courts have been pretty good about upholding these rights, so that free speech in the US so far has generally been safe from government suppression. But suppression can come from other sources. Being thrown into prison can suppress one's speech, but so might being fired from a job, attacked by a mob, expelled from school, or failing that class you need to graduate. So a robust defense of free speech is not simply a matter of having a government that's supportive. One also needs corporations and private individuals who are supportive as well. People who follow the Constitution and limiting the narrow exceptions to the freedom of speech, and generally recognizing other people's right to say things, even if we view those things as wrong or stupid or even evil. Now, there's never going to be a society where people perfectly conform to that ideal, but you might be able to see why different moral cultures can be more or less conducive to it. In an honor culture, such as you had in the Old South, people find words to be serious business and are willing to use violence when they don't like the words they hear. That's why in the Old South, being a newspaper editor was a dangerous occupation. If you published something that somebody took offense to, even a true statement of fact, you could be challenged to a duel or beaten or caned or what have you. Such cultures might not have had government regulation of what could be printed in the newspapers, but certainly the threat of violence had a chilling effect. It's dangerous to say things that might offend people, especially if they're, bigger than you. Dignity cultures, in these speech is generally less dangerous. People have a lower sensitivity to slight. More manners of disagreements and insults are seen as beneath the notice of authorities or even the offended person themselves, and people are less violent. This doesn't mean that there's no censorship or that certain speech never brings negative consequences. It just means it's generally less dangerous and you can say a wider range of things without getting into trouble. These are all matters of degree. The patterns we call victimhood culture, though, go against this. There's a really low bar for what's considered offensive, and people are encouraged to be touchy and on the lookout for slights. It's also hard to predict what'll even get you into trouble. Concepts like microaggression are defined in vague and subjective ways, so that really the only way to know if you're guilty of one is to wait for someone to decide that they define what you've said as one. Like in honor culture, words are serious business. Offensive things can be defined as a threat to safety and banned in the name of safety. Calls to ban or disinvite guest speakers at university campuses have this logic, and sometimes they're successful. And just like a person of honor would consider an insult no different than a slap in the face, so we see campus activists who say that speech is literally violence. Carrying this logic to an extreme, you can even see something that looks a little bit like honor culture, as in the example Bradley gave earlier of students who felt they were justified using violence in self-defense to stop a talk by Milo Yiannopoulos. But violence isn't a first resort, since this is a moral culture that's more reliant on third parties, and so usually what people clamor for is more regulation and top-down control. We find things like universities implementing training programs to sensitize people to what they can and can't say, promulgating lists of problematic statements, instituting reporting systems to report offensive speech, and so forth. And we also see this kind of thing spreading off of the campuses. We see corporations having their HR departments and other appendages of their administrations create lists and guidelines similar to those on universities. People might get fired for an internal memo, for example. We also see people coming to rely on another kind of authority, the authority of the mob itself. People use social media to mobilize large numbers of partisans to shame and harass people who have offended them. For example, you see something like this person who took offense at something another student said at school and retweeted it with the statement, Twitter, do your thing, let's get this girl expelled, email the Student Office of Conduct and try to get her expelled. In countries like the UK with less stringent free speech rights, police already arrest and punish people for social media posts. And of course, there are those who would like to see similar restrictions in the US. A second area of tension is between victimhood culture and due process. A cornerstone of liberal jurisprudence is due process. It's meant to protect people from the arbitrary exercise of power. It's the idea that you have certain procedural rights, such as the right to a fair trial, the right to know the charges against you, the right to consult legal counsel, and other things meant to safeguard people from being falsely accused or other arbitrary exercises of power. Obviously, the system has flaws and isn't always implemented correctly, but still, someone in this system has more protections than they would have under the old inquisitorial system in pre-modern Europe or in dictatorial or authoritarian countries. Because a system of rules and procedures and safeguards places limits on authority, it can be frustrating to people who want justice right now. Sometimes people want authorities to act with more swiftness to punish things they see as evil, and they become very impatient with rules and procedures that might occasionally let a guilty person get away. The price of protecting the innocent is sometimes the guilty get away. Moral fervor of all kinds can be hazardous to this process, whether it's the witch hunts of colonial Massachusetts or the 1980s panics over alleged satanic ritual cults and child sex abuse. When people get carried away with what sociologists call moral panics, they might immediately call for the reduction of due process, and they might become very credulous towards accusations that, if you stop to think about them, seem kind of fishy and implausible. And we might be seeing something similar to that with hate crime hoaxes today. Due process also means that authorities cannot be counted on in quite the same range of situations. Their support isn't so quick and automatic. They require things like evidence and proof. And this too can be frustrating for those who are trying to rely more on authorities to handle various slights, offenses, or problems in their lives. What all this can add up to is that when people are highly sensitive to certain kinds of offense and increasingly dependent on authorities to handle it for them, they'll probably demand and support reductions of due process. And if the US legal system still offers due process supports, they might turn to authority figures that lack such protections. Certainly, campus administrations in many universities lack the due process of the US legal system, and someone who's in trouble might be called into a meeting, not told what exactly they're charged with, and then found guilty and expelled or fired without much in the way of evidence. Social media mobs, much like mob justice throughout history, lack due process. People immediately fly off the handle when they see a report or accusation go viral, and they join in. A world full of such things means a world where everybody's subject to the arbitrary use of power. Whether it's a false accusation that people don't question, or simply the fact that in a world with a low bar for slight, we're all guilty of something, it's hard to predict when you'll get in trouble, when the eye of Sauron will fall upon you, when some grievance will go viral or some administrator will decide to make an example of you. There's a kind of randomness to it, and the randomness can make it more scary than if we had explicit rules. Dignity culture, as we defined it here, developed and flourished alongside the Enlightenment and its ideals of equality and freedom. And again, it took us a long time, and it's never been implemented perfectly. But the idea of dignity culture is that everybody has equal worth, equal rights, and we shouldn't be so quick to police and condemn each other. We shouldn't be so sensitive to slights. Dignity culture is rooted in a conception of all human beings as having equal worth, and it makes a strong distinction between words and violence, between arguments and force. It prohibits violence, but allows relatively free expression, freer than what you'll find in many cultures throughout history. It's also conducive to a stronger civil society, one in which people do not have to fear one another and can be taught to discuss and talk out their differences. It's a funny thing, but individual liberty is actually something that's collectively produced. It requires communities and cultures and institutions that are conducive to it. Social arrangements that support people in their rights to be autonomous and to say and do what they please. Let me clarify once again that the patterns we've talked about here today aren't the only threat to liberty, and we're aware of that. And some of the reactions against the things we're talking about are themselves things that threaten to undermine dignity and liberty. And this includes people who embrace offensiveness and try to exacerbate racial conflicts or bring back the old hierarchies. That too is a threat to liberty. But the patterns we've talked about today are a threat in their own right. From our point of view, the real safe space is one where discomfort and offense and disagreement are bound to happen. They're part of the normal friction of living in a society of diverse people. But it's one where people recognize it's not the end of the world, and there's room to learn from mistakes and find forgiveness. Victimhood culture encourages unending conflict and dependence upon power. Dignity culture is conducive to the social supports that provide liberty. Thanks.
What would you say is the best approach for colleges to handle this sensitive slightness?
The best approach to handle the what?
To handle like the sensitivity to these.
Yeah, the sensitivity to slight. Yeah. What is the best approach of colleges and universities to handle it? I think. I mean, for one thing, to not. I guess the idea of the first rule, to do no harm, right? So what we see is that colleges and universities are right now doing things that exacerbate that tendency. Through adopting these concepts of safe spaces, certainly microaggression reporting systems and these kinds of things that encourage people to make accusations against others. It would be a different matter if you were just talking about raising awareness, that it still could be prone to problems, but it's what we see, there was a term that was used by Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff in the Coddling of the American Mind article in The Atlantic a few years ago, vindictive protectiveness, right? So they saw that what was arising was this protectiveness of students, of victims of oppression, that was being combined with the vindictiveness. And so, where you see the, investigating people for things, running people off of campus, shutting down speakers. So we think first of all, the biggest thing is to draw a clear line between speech and violence conceptually, and to understand that there can be lively debate and disagreement and things like this, and so to make sure that and this isn't a new idea. Like, the free speech protections were already there; they're now being threatened, and so we would want those to be upheld. A lot of campuses. They tend to lose lawsuits when they get involved in these free speech issues, and so the courts have actually been ruling once they do go to court in what we would see as the correct way. So free speech protections, we see to go beyond that, beyond the do no harm kind of thing, is how can we actually facilitate people to have conversations with other people, to have conversations with the people who disagree with them politically, people from different backgrounds, and bring them together in different ways. And that would kind of, there could be, you could imagine these freshman orientation kinds of things that instead of focusing on grievances and activist politics, that would instead try to facilitate discussions between people to disagree, let people know that that's okay, that you're here. You may find things offensive, you may disagree, and those kinds of things. There have been a number of universities who have gotten on board with what's called the Chicago Statement, which is a statement about free speech and academic freedom and things like that. And that's a step in the right direction. So I think some of those things we would, the first thing would be to stop the things that are currently causing harm. And then also try to develop new ways to facilitate understanding healthy disagreement and peace at universities.
Currently, people who are most critical of this new victimhood culture, or a lot of people, are conservative Christians. Like, you see a lot of criticism coming from that corner. And I'm just curious, what role did Christianity or evangelicalism have in promoting this culture of victimhood? And I just think of, so many censorship laws were pushed forward by religious groups. The moral majority of the 80s, there's this desire to shape culture, and then when culture seemed to have gotten out of their grips, something changed. So I have no evidence on me, but I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on this.
I haven't been prepared.
So I guess I think like when we think of these tendencies, and that's we always want to we're sociologists who think of things in terms of tendencies and trends. We're ourselves somewhat uncomfortable with the moral culture terminology anyway, in the sense that I mean we didn't come up with the ideas of honor and dignity culture, but we're kind of taking those and trying to understand like the moral claims that don't fit with those, and so what would you call it? But it's more like, well, where do you get sensitivity to slight? Where do you get censorship and these kinds of things? And there can be different versions of victimhood culture, or different kinds of departures from free speech and from dignity and things like that. So I think like what you seem to be talking about is that there was a lot of maybe in a lot of hypersensitivity in an attempt to use government to shape the culture and to reverse some of the cultural trends and legal trends that had happened, and then now there seems to then be a reaction when it's kind of done from the opposite direction. Is that kind of so? Yeah. So I think there's probably something to that. You can. I think you'd want to. It would be interesting to what we're interested in especially is new moral claims, right? And it seems like the old, there were always people who were pro-censorship, right? And for particular reasons. And so, and there were also traditionally more limits on speech that than were, so it's not that, it's not that there was a time in the past where there was like, this perfect dignity culture and people, and society is wonderful. That's not actually what we're arguing. We're actually saying kind of there were these cultural ideals people could draw from and kind of appeal to about dignity, about free speech, about due process and things like that. And it's not that there weren't always opponents of those things who wanted more restrictions than other people, right? But it's the arguments against it have changed, right, to some extent. I mean, there were always, well, we need to do this because it's going to cause harm, right? But the conception of harm and which harms are important is very different. So, I mean, I think like, I certainly think that's an interesting question. I don't know that I see this as something kind of causal or something connected in a way. And more of that was just a different movement in a different time, but I would be interested in talking and thinking about it more. Yeah.
All right, so this might be beyond the scope of what you guys researched, but I was just curious if you noticed a trend in the new victimhood or the rising victimhood in the global sphere, so in college campuses around the globe, not just in the United States.
Well, we're mostly monolingual, so we're limited to English-speaking countries. I am studying Korean now, but it's slow going at age 37 to pick up a new language. Ask my in-laws. But we also looked at universities in the UK, Canada, and Australia, and my impression is it's just as or more prevalent in the UK and Canada, somewhat less so in Australia, but it's there too. You see speaking bans there, you see policies on syllabus warnings and what sort of things are considered dangerous topics. Like there was one from Australia that seemed very extensive to me and includes things like, if the course mentions abattoirs, you have to warn people about that. And there were many examples like that in my reading. So we focus on US ones because it's a US audience and probably more interesting to people, but there is a lot in international context. There's also a little bit among American expatriates and other places. One of the examples we cited in one of our articles was an American living in Japan who complained about the microaggressions the Japanese inflicted on him, such as complimenting his chopstick use or his fluency, and he felt that was wearing him down, which led to some other European and American Japanese to then argue with him in the paper about that's not the right way to handle your differences with the Japanese. So you find the same thing being reproduced other places.
So you mentioned toward the beginning of your talk that this victimhood culture seemed to explode onto the scene around 2013, 2014, which to me anecdotally seems correct. But I also know that the concept of microaggressions had been around for 15 or more years. So to what do you attribute the public emergence of victimhood culture around 2013, 2014?
It's been around longer than that, even since the 1970s, but almost no one had ever heard of it, right? So this is kind of, you had activist circles on campuses that were using this terminology. You have a lot of scholarship and other things that use this kind of oppression victimhood framework. We think, you can even go, there were different versions of what we call conflict theory, where you analyze society in terms of a struggle between groups for domination. And so, Marxism is a version of that with classes, and then others look at races or genders, and then kind of the newer ideas to look at them all as potential sources of oppression, and to analyze them as this interlocking system of oppression. So these are not new ideas. They've been there. But what we've seen is the spread beyond kind of the narrow activist circles, and even some of the terminology changing there, and certainly kind of a more aggressive use of the idea of, or more, claiming that speech isn't just metaphorically violence now, or like they used to talk about symbolic violence and things like that, but it's literally like violence. But I think like the spread of it, and then the spread, and administrators giving into it is something that we see that's new in the way that it's done now, in some of the concepts, and spreading beyond campuses and things like that. Why in 2013? So there were these, the general trends with equality and diversity and authority. We know like that number of administrators versus faculty and students has increased a lot. But I think like it would be the fourth thing that we say: diversity, equality, authority, and then new media. I think it has something. I think that would probably be account for the timing. It's somewhat speculative. I mean, I think that there's definitely that connection, but the timing of it, I think, has to do with people being able to mobilize and to communicate their grievances to others in this way. These, the rise of these Twitter mobs and other things that Jason talked about. I don't know if you...
Yeah, it's somewhat mysterious why it seemed to just be that one year when it was almost like a switch was flipped. I've seen speculation that it's partly a cohort effect. We had a generation there that's a little bit different than the one before, but social media becoming very popular, that would be another thing I'd point to. The answer is I don't have an answer, but I think those are suspects.
I would say, writing about similar things, that was Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff, and they talk about this cohort, the rise of a cohort that had always been on iPhones, right? Had grown up on them and things like that, and that was what it's accounting for. I don't, again, we don't know, and we don't, they have like lots of causal factors. I think too many to then sort out which ones were doing what. But those are some of the possible reasons too.
I was just curious if you guys felt there was some sort of action that needs to be taken, or if you think this is kind of like a fad that will kind of just fizzle away if we see a shift in political outlooks in the administration.
Oh yeah, someone called it a fad when we published our first piece like 5 years ago, and it's still going. So, as far as actions that one could take, if one does value dignity, culture, and value liberty, I've thought a lot, because I often get the question, what practical steps can we take? And I feel a bit like a weatherman explaining, well, this is how a hurricane forms. Okay, how do you stop the hurricane? I don't control the weather. And we also face the problem that, aside from these things being big, large-scale trends that it's difficult to reverse, some of these trends are positive things, like we said equality and diversity. We value those things too. It's part of dignity culture to value those things. If it's a choice between a world of oversensitive people and like Jim Crow, it's no brainer which you pick, right? So the question is how to preserve those good trends, but if this is a negative side effect in your view, which it is in mine, how do you get rid of the negative side effect? And some things we've been thinking of in terms of strategies would be, if dependence on authority and third parties, which is the thing we highlighted in this talk, is a factor, how do you reduce dependence? And people have been approaching this from a couple of different angles. You get people who lead something they call the free-range parenting movement, which is the idea that independence starts very early and kids need free time unsupervised to play and learn. You can't always call on the nearby adult to handle your problems with each other and so forth. And you get concern with reducing the size of campus administrations, which I might have administrators here who are like, no, my job's important. Okay, yeah, I'm sure. But campus administrations have, I don't say this at my own university. Campus administrations have grown dramatically in the past several decades. Exact statistics vary depending on what you see quoted, but it's something like a doubling versus faculty and students only went up by like a quarter or 30% or something like that. And so you have this large bureaucracy, including many organs of social control, agencies designed to police offenses, and agencies tend to get used once they're created. They'll find deviants to police, and you hire a witch finder general, you're going to find witches in your community. So trying to find some way to choke off that growth, that prune back the bureaucratic kudzu. Now, if I knew how to do that, I'd probably be some sort of libertarian hero. But you could try to find some strategies to reduce that or stop the growth of it. And another thing I've been thinking of lately, and this is something that I might write a follow-up piece on one day, is just organizing community at the ground level so that people have other, they're not just isolated individuals floating around wondering who's going to support me if someone's mean to me. If you can have community organized and try to find some sort of, organic organizations that counterbalance the organizations up above. Again, if I knew how to do this with a foolproof plan, I'd be a hero, but it seems like a strategy one could pursue.
Just also kind of on that, thinking of like, is it a fad that'll go away? Will political winds shift? All these kinds of things. I think what we're seeing, it's not going away, but also that that it can be part of what leads to reaction. Jason mentioned that a little bit in the talk, that there are reactions to victimhood culture that are not drawing from dignity culture at all. And so I think like the political polarization occurring in the country is generally a threat to dignity culture, not just this left-wing campus activist thing. It's not the focus of of our book, but the prominence of the alt-right, all these things are also connected, partly just new media and these kinds of things. But I think like what you're getting is different kinds of reactions where some people, you have people embracing a kind of offensiveness and others, and pointing to the victimhood culture stuff as justification for that. There's a lot going on in the society, and they do seem to be playing off on one another where extremes lead to other extremes instead of kind of moderating one another. And I think that's going to continue on both sides.
So I think the sticks and stones may break my bones was used in reference to dignity culture. So would you say that dignity culture forced people to bottle up slights, whereas victimhood culture motivates people to react immediately and not accept slights?
To some extent. I mean, it's a... And again, like we're using this like as shorthand terms for like big, broad patterns of lots of internal variation. But if you look at sort of the predominant social pattern amongst, say, like the middle classes in the 20th century, we kind of look at as the epicenter of dignity in contrast to honor or victimhood. There's an ethic of restraint. So yeah, it does mean sometimes restraining oneself from reacting to slights. But it could also mean, not acting on your emotions immediately and thinking of a more productive way to handle it. So talking things out, like we often describe this with the phrases we grew up with, hearing when we were kids, like, talk it out like grown-ups, that kind of thing. So the sticks and stones thing or the talk it out like grown-ups thing. And that seems to be something that was often upheld as an ideal rather than, an emotional response. The one that really encourages like immediate emotional response, I think, is honor, because there it's hair trigger and showing you have immediate no hesitation is really the thing that's valued. The responses in like campus culture, they're not always so like immediate and emotional right in the face of somebody. They might be, I'm going to go home and tweet about this and so forth. If you're talking about like encouraging people to burden or shoulder the burden of slights, though, I mean, you don't necessarily have to do that to discourage sensitivity to it. You could also encourage other ways of handling it. Is that kind of what you were getting at?
Yeah. No, because it's certainly, it's a danger, right? Like, when is it telling people to ignore slights. Of course, it was always a little bit of a fiction, right? Sticks and stones and break bones, words won't hurt me. And of course, words hurt people, right? Like that. It's not saying. I mean, people are often hurt more by words than by the sticks and stones. But it's a moral distinction, right? It's to say, like, the law isn't about protecting your feelings. The law is about protecting you from sticks and stones. This is kind of like Thomas Jefferson talking about freedom of religion and saying, like, I don't care if my neighbor worships one god or 20. Just as long as he doesn't pick my pocket or break my leg or whatever. So this is so it's a distinction that's made for a purpose, right? It's not an absolute statement about how people are affected, and it's not saying that there are then no ways of dealing with hurt feelings. It's more like it has to do with certain kinds of environments, and it's never meant as an absolute. It's also, people talked about this as a characteristic of the dignity cultures that had replaced honor cultures already, so we're kind of playing off of that. But as Jason was saying, in honor cultures, you wouldn't say that. You say, like, words are serious, right? You have to, you must fight, right? Defend our family, defend yourself if somebody insults you. And the idea was to teach them, no, just let it go. We don't want violence, and we don't want violence back and forth, and we want to decrease that. But it does fit in, and again, it's not a matter of absolute. It's an understanding of what dangers there are, right? So you mentioned there's possible danger of bottling things up and not talking about them, but there are other kinds of things. So cognitive behavioral therapy is probably possibly the most effective form of therapy. There's evidence that it's effective anyway. Maybe more than other kinds. For depression, for anxiety, these kinds of things. And it talks about, not mind reading, right? Like not assuming you know what others think, or catastrophizing. What will happen will be so unbearable I can't stand it. And so what we see, so a lot of this, the advice you'd see in what we're calling victimhood culture goes against that, right? It's encouraging these things that we know have psychological consequences. Now, maybe you can go too far the other way, but at least keep in mind that there's this danger. And what would cognitive behavioral therapy, or and it's not as if the cognitive behavioral therapist suddenly discovered something. You can go back to all kinds of ancient wisdom, and you would recognize this. Why do you see the speck in your neighbor's eyes, but don't notice the log in your own eye? First, take the log out of your own eye, and then you'll see clearly to take the speck out of your neighbor's eye, right? The idea that Jesus is saying here, focus on your own faults and not the faults of others. Looking at the minor offenses of others isn't your job, and focus on the acts of others. And it's putting people on kind of an equal plane, that you all have things that you do that are wrong or offensive, and to turn inward and to examine yourself. And again, it's not that, we're not gurus here trying to, give a new morality ourselves, right? We're actually just trying to point to some of the dangers of this new morality that we see rising, and dangers that we think people should be more worried about.